So, On Such a Full Sea, the book that you were reading from, is your first stab at, not really sci-fi, but futuristic fiction, a fiction that's set not in the world that we live in or the world of the past. When it started out, it was going to be a socio-realist novel about factory towns in China. How did that change?
Well, it was a real surprise to me, actually. I remember writing the first sentences of just what I read to you and thinking to myself, am I really doing this? It's sort of like looking down at the abyss. I remember going to Jamaica once, and there's this big waterfall, and it was just the same feeling, like looking down. Are you really doing this?
Did you do it in Jamaica?
I did jump, and my girlfriend at the time was horrified. She was down at the bottom, and she said, you can't jump. It's this little kid had jumped before me, and of course he'd jumped it maybe 1,500 times, and I was just steeled by the rum I'd been drinking. But back to the book. I wanted to write that novel. It was just a fairly straightforward novel about workers and labor in China and all the kinds of interesting things that are going on in China. But I sort of felt as if maybe it was too straightforward, and maybe I didn't have this special something that I think you need to begin a novel. It either has to be something formal or in terms of a certain kind of feeling or structural or something, and I hadn't quite found that in that novel, and I just was kind of sort of putting it away and kind of just letting it suspend, and then I got this idea about bringing over laborers en masse to America, and what they would do. What I thought was, and this was the strange premise I had, was to bring these laborers over to abandoned areas of urban areas of the United States, and particularly in this case Baltimore, East Baltimore, and that's why this place is called Bmore. But in thinking about that premise, of course, you can't really imagine that happening anytime soon, or in any society that we can know. And so I thought, well, I suppose that premise could work, but in a very different future, in a radically changed circumstance. And I realized that that I would have to set it in the future. I didn't really want to. It was really going to be more, in some ways, an immigrant novel, but an immigrant novel in which the community was sort of engineered from the start, like a labor facility or a production facility. And I was just interested in the questions about community then and how that community might develop over time. But the more that, but once you set something in the future, then unfortunately, you have to describe that future, even if you don't want to. But actually, I found that I was quite enjoying describing that future and thinking about the contours of the society and how it might have changed from what we know now.
Now, when you write about, as you have, about the Korean War or the Second World War, you can do research. And you can figure out how things were, and you can get some kind of feel from testimony, personal testimony.
Right.
This kind of novel, there's nothing like that. Is it liberating to make it all up? Or scary?
It's a little bit of both.
Yeah.
I did find that a lot of the research that I'd done in China and the factories surrounding Shenzhen was actually very useful to me. Mm-hmm. Not for the an exact correspondence, of course, to what I wrote about, but more about the feeling or mentality or ethos of the workers. and the kinds of ways in which they would put themselves into these situations where they weren't slaves, but where their destinies, both inside the factory and outside, were fairly limited. So that I think is like the most important thing, about writing about the future. It's not so much about the architecture or the technology, or at least for me, it's not. Some writers do, when they're writing about the future, they really want to come up with a manual for that, for that time. And I certainly wasn't interested in that. But I wasn't obviously very interested in the human factor. And so that really helped. But once you do have to describe some of the world, and how it's situated and how it works, that is kind of fun, because you realize that, when you're writing that other kind of fiction, that everyone knows what you're writing about. And so you have to constantly look for a fresh angle or something slightly odd or surprising. And in this case, it's not as if you could completely make it up. I mean, it does, of course, have to seem somewhat familiar in a strange way. Plausible, familiar, likely almost.
Yeah.
And I began to turn my thoughts towards how might I extend or extrapolate from what I know now, and obviously what I'm concerned about now. People have asked me a lot about this book, and did you have this whole sort of political kind of agenda, or all these ideas about our society, and that's how you wrote this book? And I said, it absolutely didn't happen that way. But each time that this heroine fan goes out into the world and engages with a microculture and its people, I suppose that all the things that I had been thinking about, worrying about in recent years and all my life, began to take form. So in some ways, it comes about just by, at least for me, it came about by just kind of, taking stock of what I suppose my worries were, my anxieties.
Yeah, well, most novels set in the future are set in a future that we're afraid of. And our mutual friend Gary Steingart always says that his novel was set, 2 minutes in the future, right? By the time it came out, it had come true. And maybe we should explain for people who haven't read the book, but the setup here is that there's, in this world you've created, there's this vast distinction between the haves and have-nots.
Yep.
And there's a lot of sickness, and there's environmental disaster. All of these things that are probably your worries. Do you think of it as, in a way, a kind of social protest novel? I mean, do you think most science fiction is that?
I think so. I mean, there's very little protest in the novel itself. And so maybe I would bring up an example of a novel that I loved and I think is a good social protest novel, which is Zola Germinal. That's about coal miners in this fictional northern French town, and it's all about all their struggles, the injustice, the way they're exploited, and everything, the owners and.
So you could have written about the Chinese factories.
I could have done that, yeah. And so after you read that book, you just, you want to become, a Marxist. I mean, you want to just burn everything down, and you just think this whole place is rigged. And of course, you read the paper, and then it's like that too. But yeah. So, but I guess as I began writing this novel, I told myself, just describe the world and let yourself, again, find stories inside of it. And those stories will naturally have a certain kind of filter on them, or a trajectory, or a certain kind of feeling. And that's what we do as writers. I mean, you can't engineer, you can't engineer your ideas. You have them. But if you start doing that, if you start trying to get to them via via your characters and situations and language, I think you get into trouble. I think it's either too direct or it's shrill or and then it ultimately doesn't work. And one of the things that I think I was ultimately interested in this novel was how little friction in a way there was inside the society. That all these people who live in various sectors, you know, the very privileged people, the workers in Bmore, and then those people outside who have nothing, they completely accept the world as it is. They really don't question it very much. There's a little bit of questioning by the people in Bmore once Fan goes out into the world. But that's for me what the scariest part of maybe the book, and maybe that's one of the, if anything, there's a political message there, was I found that people were so resigned. And that to me was the most haunting, I think, thing. Not the environment, not that other thing.
Yeah. Well, resignation is something that comes up in your writing quite often. People looking back on life or resigned to the situations that they're living in. In A Gesture Life and in The Surrendered, you looked pretty closely at war and pretty closely at some very, very brutal things that happen during war. At the same time, you seem to be drawn to narrators who are a little bit distant, who are a little bit reserved. How do you reconcile that in the voice of your writing, these sort of attraction to brutality, and then this kind of calm distance from it?
Well, I think that's, to me, it's a very natural combination. Yeah. And it's not that I'm so interested in violence, but I find that in certain moments in narrative that violence serves a lot of interesting purposes. It's obviously often cathartic, but also it breaks a rhythm sometimes that you've been building in a good way, sometimes in a disruptive way. And then the most interesting part for me is about the aftermath of that violence and the cogitation and the consciousness that happens after. And that usually is, for me, in a very, very quiet register, right? Someone who's trying to hold everything together so that they can see into that moment and see after that moment as clearly as possible. And so in a way, it seems like it's inevitable that, rather than having all this action and then having the response be somehow commensurate. I don't know if I could do that, but I don't know if I could even understand that in a way. And maybe it's because also my narrators tend to be people who aren't, who don't have a lot of volition, who don't have control over their destinies. And I don't know why I tend to.
I was going to say why.
Yeah, gravitate to those people. Well, I don't know if it's just the way I've lived or how I grew up, but I've always felt that there was a lot of poignancy in people who are put into situations and find themselves there, and they really can't, for whatever reason, either means or desire, just can't quite get out, and that they have to sit with it and marinate in it, and and somehow make a certain kind of peace with it. And that to me seems to me, I don't know, it's just a story that opens up a lot of interesting angles on human possibility. What people will think and do, and sometimes it's violent stuff, and sometimes it's self-destructive. Sometimes it's beautiful, right? Yeah.
So your narrators vary quite a bit. I mean, your heroes and heroines, you've written about Koreans, Korean Americans. Fan, the heroine of this book, is Chinese. The hero of Aloft is Italian American. Men, women, equal opportunity,
Yeah.
right? What gets you going with a character? How do these people take shape? None of them. Well, I mean, possibly your first book, but very few of them seem to be you or based on you.
Yeah, even the first book.
Yeah.
Not really me at all.
Yeah.
I guess, unlike some other writers, I really try not to write about me. Maybe it's because I'm a little scared about really looking into that.
Save your memoir for later.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you know, but the truth is, of course, that all the characters that I've been interested in and written about, they do have, you know, significant DNA from me, and how I see the world and what I worry about, and a certain, as you say, a certain kind of reserve. Although I'm not that reserved in life. I guess I'm more reserved in the page. People always meet me in life, and they're always. I always get this, that people are they think I'm just going to jump all over them or something. Maybe because my narrators are constantly thinking.
Because people go woo when you come on stage,
I know.
right?
And then they meet me and they think, gosh, you know, you're not like that at all. Yeah. But of course, writing and being I think, are two different things. I mean, you need to be there, and you need to be present. You need to let all these things happen personally. So I don't know where the characters come from. I think they're all, well, I'll say one thing. They're sort of anti-wishes. They're the people that I'm afraid of becoming. And maybe all of them, except for this last one, Fan. I want to be Fan. Because she's so elemental and pure. Yeah. She's innocent. She's naive. She's, you know, not moral. She's like a tree, you know. She's just there, and so I would say she's the only hero of mine that I would like to attain, you know. And
you made a kind of unorthodox choice in writing about her, which was to write about her in a first-person plural, this we that's observing her, or somehow omnisciently observing her.
Yes.
It's a very difficult voice to sustain for a whole book. It's not common. What made you do that?
Well, I realized that it wasn't so easy, because about 2 chapters in, I thought, can I continue to do this? You know, you know, it's like. But one of the things I figured out about that plural voice is that at least the plural voice that I wanted and required was that. It really ranges. I mean, sometimes it sounds like an individual. Sometimes almost hopes that it's an individual. Sometimes it's reliable. Sometimes very much not. Sometimes it's very hopeful. Sometimes it's completely, you know, making things up maybe. So I liked the range of that voice, and I felt it was the only way to both tell the story, but also to try to draw out everything about how this community was engaged with and digesting Fan's exploits and adventures. Because her adventures are all about, she doesn't change within it. It's very simple. She has a very simple mission to find her boyfriend, but all the people she meets in this society have all these, you know, hang-ups, you know, strange practices, morality issues, and so it was a way for me to draw out the community who was telling her story as richly and as widely as possible, and that's why I decided I didn't want to have, say, you know, her cousin telling the story about her going out, because then it would just be this one person's perspective on it, and not that can't range, but I also wanted to just work with the idea that this whole community was watching her and very much invested in her, whether they wanted to be or not.
One thing that comes up sometimes in your fiction is the sort of wayward child. In a way, Fan is this child who's gone off and left her family of sorts. So I'm just going to jump back 20 years when you hadn't written any novels and you were a financial analyst and then you went wayward. How did that happen?
How did the waywardness happen? Well, I looked around, well, this, and really, people always bring this up, but I worked there literally 365 days. The 365th day I quit.
Did you get your bonus that day?
Yes, but I wanted to say that I worked there a year, and that I explored it, discovered it, and found out all about it. And that
was it research, or was it originally a career plan?
No, it was not a career path. It was really just, this was a time when, this was in 1987, I graduated from college, and back then before October, the market was going crazy, and so, that spring, people from Wall Street firms would come to campus and throw these fabulous parties. And my girlfriend at the time really wanted one of those jobs. She was she was an econ major, and she was constantly going. And one night she said, "Why don't you just come, to this party?" And I said, "I don't want to go to that party, She said, "There'll be free scotch, and they have a raw bar." So I thought, all right, I guess I'll go. And they did have you kind of had to dress nicely, I suppose. You should just put on a tie and just go, and you can hang out at the buffet. So that's exactly what I was doing. I was hanging out at the buffet, and this guy comes up to me and starts talking to me about, we were drinking wine or something, and he starts talking to me about wine and how I value wine, and what I liked about wine, and I was just blathering on. And at the end of it, he said, "You want to come meet my colleagues back in New York next week?" And I was like, "About what?"
About wine.
Yeah. So he seemed like a cool guy, and I said, "Okay." And you sort of, that's how you got a job in the old days.
It's like the CIA.
And this is this is ancient times.
Yeah.
So that's how that happened. But I ended up leaving because I realized that every other person on the floor where I was working wanted to write the great American novel. They didn't really want to be there. They loved the money.
Yeah.
But they all had these other things they wanted to do, sail or write the novels and I kept hearing that, and I said, and I'd been writing the whole time, and I was an English major in college, but I never really thought that I could be a writer, and I thought to myself, well, I can always go back and make money somehow, but maybe I should just try, give myself 5 years like Updike did. I remember reading that. Mm-hmm. Or he asked his parents for 5 years, and so I said, I'll give myself a few years and see what happens. And it took more than 5 years, but so I ended up quitting, and that's how I didn't get rich.
That's why you're here.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, everyone.